Forgotten Saints. With the saints came the faithful, thousands of them, more than Kleiphos had ever seen at once. In fact, he wasn't sure he'd ever seen so many people in total, and never in so many varieties. They had arrived there first, as was the nature of the followers of the Nameless One. To arrive late would have been a show, would have drawn attention, a clear sign of a lack of humility. But would arriving early not draw notice? Always arriving exactly on time not? Wasn't constant humility noticeable? Was striving for the greatest humility not a contradiction? The theological aspects his fellows often debated had always circulated around his head like passing clouds. But here? Now? At this moment, with so many thousands cheering, praying, arriving, thousands of followers for 8 holy figures, he could not deny the draw, the spiritual connection that lay so thick that he felt he could reach out and pluck it. There was excitement in them all, even in his brothers and sisters that took the oaths to mean the necessity to be a constant drag on every moment of fun. Even those who took it to mean the destruction of themselves, who hid themselves in masks and did all they could to obscure the individual. Even they excitedly tapped their feet, or quietly hummed, or nervously turned their heads this way and that. The Order Militant of the Nameless was what they called themselves now. Not only the greatest reformers, devout warriors, but the most elite of their number. While he found the Eosians and Saintsmeetites a tad queer, their obsessively detailed martial codices had been impressive, and their training under them had made them into an elite to shake even the mightiest of Aversarinas' legions. While there were thousands of faithful, each reformer's order militant stood apart, each so distinct in dress and ability and culture. There were they who followed the Nameless, of course. Many now called them the Saint, as the Thesians did, though each reformer rejected that title. But what else to call such legends? Those that followed the masked were perhaps the most dour of all the militant, though in private they still enjoyed their revelry after battle and during the peaceful hours of free nights. Many of them still smiled or chattered, but he knew that none of the gawking faithful looked at them. They stared at the members of their order calling themselves Forgotten Ones, those who utterly removed the self, garbed as they were in deep blacks and blues and silvered armor and masks. Militant as he was, he still only counted a few among those zealots as regular company. Most of the Forgotten Ones belonged to a different scion, the Order of the Voidborn, most fanatical of all the sects from what he'd been told. Then there were the less creepy ones, those from orders he was less familiar with. First to arrive after them had been the Order Militant of Legensanzia in their great legions. Even as the rebels increasingly became zealots, the Saintsmeetites had always seemed the least devout. Not that they lacked discipline, though, for, instead of holy fervor, they fought with military precision. Sanzia's Order Militant built upon 7 entire state legions that had seen 1,000 campaigns before the rebellion. Unlike the others, they stood in formation, led by a vanguard of what they called the Order of the Rose, all women, all veterans handpicked by Sanzia herself, all in reds and golds, and with roses adorning their helmets in mimicry of their leader. If any of them blinked, he could not tell, and he couldn't help but imagine that they all stood so strict and stiff that if one were to be knocked over, they would all topple. Once his eyes slid from their glimmering armor and hardened faces, his eyes fell on the Calistonians. They were the loudest of the lot. He was fairly sure they had only showed up so early because a storm had swept their ships to the island, and while Kleiphos was sure he enjoyed their revelry 2 nights prior, he could scarcely remember it, and was fairly sure one of them had stolen his purse. They were also the least uniform. All the Wave Riders' traditional teals and whites, of course, but they were sailors first, faithful and soldiers second and third, or perhaps 5th and 6th after pirates, bandits, and scoundrels. They laughed and hooted at passerbys, played dice in what open areas they could find, or openly ogled at the Thesians. Despite this, Kleiphos felt respect for them. Many of them had been fighting the slavers for decades before their rebellions, even before he had realized his homeland's evils. Many showed the scars and brands of former slaves, all tattooed over the symbols of Callisto's fleet. He respected them the most. A decade ago, he'd have spit on them. Now he realized they were stronger than he'd ever be. Decanosianites were also there. Out of all the orders, Kleiphos found them the least enjoyable. Even harmless pranks were likely to find outsiders brought to a magistrate. The bulk of their militants sat in a semicircle around some higher-ranking speaker, who droned off a booklet about matters of law or theology or some such. The few words drifting over the crowds were so terribly boring that it amazed him they considered their patron holy. What spiritual master was so cruel that they forced their followers to memorize things like the legal basis for theological suit after the Elitatosian legal reforms of 951, Even processing that nearly made him abandon the rebellion out of pure boredom. Unlike him, the lot of them, sitting, kneeling, and standing in that circle, seemed so enraptured that they might as well have been at the arena. More power to them. The Aeosians, of course, were drilling, or praying, or polishing swords and armor. Half of them used to be mercenaries, or adventurers, and while they marched with the Sanzianites, they were certainly different. Each one of them acted like they were the purest themselves, speaking more like priests than warriors, and with a fascination with perfecting the martial arts bordering on fetishism. Kleiphos never wanted to fight one in his life, but he also certainly never wanted to drink with one. Not that he imagined they consumed anything besides water and hardtack. Thesians were among the lot. A few of their order stood praying, silently, as they did. They were worshipping their reformer as a saint even before the lot of them had caught on to it, and loved her almost as much as their needles and sutures. He gave a playful wink to a passing hospitaller, pretty as they all were, which she rolled her eyes at, and nearby Brother Osithos gave a disapproving grunt to. Oh, if only he were a Callistoan. Philanthropists had gotten there later than most, though he imagined that's because they fought one another for the right to take the most pathetic ship to the island possible, before finally settling on a bunch of logs. The fighting poor walked honorably through the crowd, ignoring the festivities and celebrations, and looking miserable. While a few seemed cheerful, he imagined a life insisting on the least luxurious food they could eat was hardly one worth leading. Still, there were those among them with sharp eyes and looser scruples for drink and sustenance. He had heard many rumors of cheery Philanthropus' connections with brigands and bandits across the east. And last to arrive had been the Catharatosians, as mixed a group as any, only beaten in lack of uniformity by the Callistoans. While they had legionnaires who had draped themselves in the traditional browns and greens, and members of the Militant in polished armor and grimacing full helms, a greater half of their Militants seemed to be little more than peasants burned out on Ceridonian bitterleaf. A fun lot to revel with, if they'd bother to turn up on time, or if he desired to join whatever self-loving madness that they no doubt enraptured themselves with. Of all the orders, he had heard they had the more distant relationship with their patron, Catharatos seeming far more fascinated at the process of milk turning to cheese, or what the prettiest star was, than the ongoing war. Just punishment for those who chose an ancient mystic as their leader, he supposed. The other thousands were of course more motley than anyone. A great mass of peasant rebels, deserters, adventurers, maddened zealots, camp followers, local townspeople from the nearby fishing villages, various nobles and notables with a desperate desire to be seen who had somehow managed access, escaped slaves, mercenaries, several Chevalian knights with a company of northern sellswords, and a growing list of poor sods had tangled themselves up in the rebellion. He supposed most had simply thrown money in with the winning side, or maybe they just wanted to see a saint. Either way, around Kleiphos swirled a barrage of celebration, prayer, scholarly lessons, practicing swordsmen, and more. And so they had been for the past few hours. And so it had been the day prior, and the entire week. All because it was here the reformers would finally meet, each one in person, all at once. The simple thought captured his mind every time he tried to think of it. To Kleiphos' thinking, they couldn't be gods. Reincarnations of the first men? Perhaps. He had heard of many named the same in his childhood, somewhere in Malqua. Even if their patron spoke so much about why this was an evil, if so many could be reincarnations of the first men, and if every cult and preacher across Aversaria put their number between hundreds and thousands, then what did it matter? Their holiness was a constant debate in his mind, but he never understood the controversy. But that's not why he was excited. He had been nothing besides a fisher, then a legionnaire of the 21st Legion, the noble 21st Legion veracity of his local backwater in Malqua, of course, not the fabled 21st State Fansis that got to name itself after the autocratia, and everyone pissed themselves over celebrating endlessly. He'd ran around his stretch of nowhere for 6 years, playing soldier and stomping over endless amounts of nobodies from other nowheres, or running from a stomping himself. The closest to an important person he'd seen then was his commanding noble, a magi with a startling ability to make sparkles that ranked somewhere in the imperial hierarchy below every other magi and just above everyone else. No, it excited him because of the saints, or reformers, or patrons, whatever they were important. Not only were they important, but they had stomped so many important people that the autocrator himself made decrees about them by name. And sure, one of Fancis's sons may have been a monster, but the autocrator himself? If he could somehow touch one of them, shake their hands, he'd be one step from the autocrator himself, the ruler of the world. The thought sent his mind spinning, Kleiphos, the fisher boy from a purest forgotten part of Malqua, just a handshake from the autocrator. And they even said Thesia and Sansia had met him. He turned to brother Osithos and sister Parthsa, two of his closer friends. They were the most overly zealous humdrums he could imagine, and while they didn't wear the metal masks of the Forgotten Ones, they still insisted on keeping their mouths wrapped with cloth at all times, and claimed it improper for others to see their faces or show untoward affections. He was also fairly sure they were fucking, and also knew for a fact that Osithos cheated at cards so often it was obvious he was from Aranoi. "Why, again, can I not go join in on the festivities?" he asked Osithos. They held the same rank, of course, and nobody had ordered him not to gamble with the Calistoans he was pointing to, but the rest of his order had stood silently and creepily glared at everyone walking past, and so there he was too. He imagined half of them were in a similar boat. "Because it is improper," Osithos said, with his eyes rolling as he tended to. "Simply impious," Parthsa added. "Truly, you are in full uniform and armor, to take these gifts and show the others that you are content to show yourself as a representative of our leader by—" Osithos turned to where Kleiphos pointed and fell silent as soon as he saw them playing Seven Dragons, the same game Kleiphos was fairly sure Osithos had cheated half the order's coin with. "By acting improper," Parthsa snapped, slapping Osithos lightly on the wrist and snapping him back to the material realm from whichever fantasy of infinite gambling he drifted to. "Ah, yes, of course, improper, and showing no small amount of pride in gambling festivities." "You know," Kleiphos tried, "it really feels like with something as vague as humility, we can feel bad about doing literally anything. What if I go and roll with that pretty Thesian over there? You know she must be good with her hands." "Kleiphos Vathidiax," Parthsa gasped. "But what if I did it just averagely? Nothing I could take undue pride in, nor so poorly to insult. I'll even do it moderately quickly in an act of humility." "You know Parthsa will hurt you, brother," Osithos chided, though Kleiphos could tell he was holding back a laugh. "Don't worry, it's completely holy. Hell, if it's all the same to Parthsa, I can grab a Sansianite, and I'll probably be begging for her to hide her face." He slowly drifted off as he realized he was the only one talking. Anywhere. In the entire crowd. While he had rambled, the thousands of assembled revelers had shut the hell up for the first time in a week and let his words echo into the air. He slowly turned to where the rest were looking and watched as the entire crowd separated. "Brothers!" came a dreadful shout from Latalagos Sekos. "To your positions!" And just like that, his training was back. No matter how many Thesians raced through his mind, all straightened and marched through the crowd with silent and decidedly humble determination. It was an art, marching impressively without seeming proud, and he imagined that for as humble as they were, just that once they may have broken their vows. In all their armor, moving so smoothly, he knew they looked impressive, and he'd rather be proud of that than anything else. They had lined up as they moved, marching step and forming a perfect line without further command, and the various crowds scattered before them. They trained for hours for the ceremony, of course. Eos and Sansi had been the ones throwing this together, and purists forbid the soldiers not march for the generals. Not that he minded. Gave him a front row view. They slammed to a stop, facing off from the Calistoans who, somehow, held some manner of formation despite half of them being pissed drunk. "Tell Parthsa I apologize," he whispered to his left, into the ear of Osithos. "She never had time to hit me." "She knows your humor. Now shut up. It's improper," Osithos answered. That was true. While he'd enjoyed his youthful carousing, that had of course ended before he joined the Legion as a boy, after he married his wife, when Nathsa had... well, he didn't need to think about that just now. The crowd was still hushed to silence by the realization that the show was starting, or perhaps just because everyone else was. Despite this, excited whispers drifted from down the old stone road they lined up on, getting louder and closer as he imagined so too did the Saints. Behind the Calistoans, a short and rattish man climbed upon some box and stood at attention. Then a fancily uniformed Sansianite behind her order, and a tall and knobbly elder behind the Catharatosians. And he imagined the same happening behind them as well. They all had their roles to play, words to say. Everyone had to be equal, after all. The box-standing lieutenants all looked down the row, nodded at someone, then shouted as one. "Now marching are soldiers of honor, recently returned from victory against the foul du Pretheran of Sakis and Aetios. Carried are the spoils of the treasury of Kataza, captured standards of the 12th and 14th Aranoian Governorial Legions, and 600 proud volunteers freed from Prethorin's foul chains. Marching now are the heroic Legion Ulternos and Kothexir Paskos Veriolgix. They all stood still, of course. Cheering and clapping were too fun for them, and a horrible sign of taking pride in anything. The crowd, however, went mad. So many people cheered and clapped that he was afraid the noise would echo through his opened helmet until his head burst, and the muddied grounds shook with jumping and the stomping. The two generals passed, Kleiphos' eyes rapidly scanning each. Ulternos was fatter, half as tall, and older by twice what he expected. Despite that, the man stomped forward as if going to fight whatever sat at the end of the road, and decorations and awards covered his armor in such number that he wasn't able to count them before he passed. Next to him, Paskos, the heathen, as the lot of them called the Apokiokin, was half as impressive and twice as interesting. The Magi's famous tic was obvious, the right side of his face constantly twitching, stretching glowing veins and combining with his disheveled clothes to mark him as a madman. Despite that, he was apparently as Decanosian as they came, and had ruined the hopes and dreams of half the Malquasiac legions in the past months. Kleiphos supposed he had deserted at the right time. Behind them rolled carts of gold, trophies, and goods. Then 2 horsemen holding the banners proudly, more cheers coming in waves every time they pushed them up. Then finally came the slaves, all cleaned, dressed, and fed, and an expected mix of happy, surprised, and afraid of the crowd and the freedom. It was a queer thing that he'd have never blinked at 1,000 of them being worked to death only a decade ago, and now they all stood there and treated them like a victorious army. He ignored those who smiled or shuffled with their eyes down, but he locked eyes with the ones glaring angrily. Those he understood, those he respected. More announcements, more heroes, more cheering. Legion Visea of the 87th Oedipesian Governorial, dragging Legion Methodiax of the 22nd Aranoian Governorial behind her in chains. Grim Magister Ulridicon, representative of Prince Mehixos himself, who Kleiphos ogled at the prestige of as he rode past. Soldiers of Sanzia's 19th, who somehow slew Ilrig Bloodbane without getting turned to magical ash. 4 Decanosian nobles who had managed the equally impossible feat of using Aversarian law to release 1,000 slaves. An ancient-looking magi named Philogomix, who was apparently a decorated Philan-Trojan general. And then, even lesser-known but still heralded names from the years of the rebellion. The Marcher Andy of the Quick Fingers, Calathipsomian Drurag Marhax, Gladiatrix cum insurgent Sela Bloodiest, the former slave Mehenod, who had torn apart Carmrez after he threw a brick at a Legion, the Magi who only went by Whisperer, one of theirs at least. Heroes and heroes, legends and legends, so many that Kleiphos' mind wandered off. But then came the reformers. Respected Elder, the one has traveled across the lands of Aeras, and who inspired our world to true purity, wise Catharatos. The crowd roared as the first of the saints came down the street. Kleiphos had expected an old and surly-looking man, with a big bushy beard and a gnarled wooden staff wearing nothing besides a dirty robe and his dirtier feet. Instead, came riding on the back of a horse, an extremely impressive soldier, with an old and surly-looking man possessing a big bushy beard and a gnarled wooden staff on the back of the saddle, and waving at them as he passed, despite a look that said he didn't want anyone to wave back. It surprised Kleiphos to see him wearing clothes, at least, even if his tunic was on backwards. They all saluted, and the Catharatosians knelt and remained there after he passed. Healer of Arispol, savior of 1,000 lives, learned of all the world's medicine, Thesia of Ethicion. More cheers, and this time the saint bothered to ride alone. It surprised him that despite tales of her beauty, she was older than his mother would have been. She didn't look like a goddess risen to him, more like a kindly old village healer. She cast a pleasant smile to the cheering crowd and passed him by. Despite her lack of glory, he still stared in fascination. The woman who had, as the story said, captured the heart of the autocrator himself, who had saved Arispol from destruction, who arguably brought about the entire idea of living saints. Despite her lack of noticeability, he couldn't help but feel honored at being so close, and they saluted as the Thesians knelt, just as the others. The forger of just law, he who has fought as bravely among the courts as others have on the battlefield, do and magistrate magi, Isaacus Decanos. Decanos, at least, looked the part. It helped that he was as blue blood as they came, and dressed like it. He certainly looked fancier than the noble he had lived under, though, despite his impressive dress, Decanos seemed the plainest-looking man he had ever seen. He had only seen his own patron once, but he imagined Decanos could easily double for the masked one, with how humble his face was. Down went the Decanosianites, and so too did they salute their patron. Eos was next, his extensive titles and honors still being read as he rode past. Now that was a saint, done up in armor so polished and fancy that he could see his own face reflecting off of it, even from so far. And then the saint thrust his blade in the air, and his eyes shot open in surprise as it did, in fact, ignite into glorious flames. He'd always assumed the stories were just those, but he supposed they had to be real now. Did he really kill a lich with that? He had even been sure liches weren't truly real until a minute prior. Eos was apparently younger than Kleiphos, but he could never imagine himself being considered elder to such a saint. Then came Legansanzia, riding with the full military bearing he had expected. The Rose of the Legion was... To say he felt his breath catch in his chest would have been something else. He didn't feel bad to say she was even more beautiful than Nathsa, his heart and life, had been. He knew she would have said the same. Despite vicious scars running down her face, and a clear wear from endless battles, the Rose, with said famous rose in her hair and all around her slung helmet, was far more beautiful than tales described. Unsurprising that even the most solemn order members from across the road struggled not to turn their heads to follow. Callisto was up next, older, stout, and laughing and hooting as he picked familiar faces from the crowd. The Callistoans knelt, and tried their best not to laugh at the jokes and loving abuse that the Wave Rider threw down at them. Kleiphos couldn't help but feel impressed, and desired nothing more in that moment than to get wasted with him, something Callisto had beaten him to, judging by the 2 empty flasks hanging off his belt. Despite all of it, despite the decorum, the honor, the odd impressiveness of the lot, his own feelings about their role and his respect for them, he couldn't help but imagine them naked. It wasn't because he wished to, but because he struggled to imagine it. Were they just... people? Not reincarnations, not gods. They refused to even be saints. Even his own patron's biggest disgust was the endless claims of the purists' reincarnation. But they weren't like the rest of them. No matter how mad Catharatos seemed, or plain Decanos looked, they weren't. He could feel it. They weren't normal. Strip the armor, the clothes, even the skin and muscles and flesh. Would their bones be like his? Did saints eat and drink? Well, he supposed Callisto must, but the rest? Did they sleep, relieve themselves, or belch, or wake up one day with a sore back and a headache? Did they fuck and love, and dream of the boy or girl they were too nervous to pursue as a youth? That any of these things could be somewhere within the endless stories was a war in his mind. It was as if they had told him the purist was also a little fisher boy from Malquois. How could he call any of them, well, human? These thoughts came to a halt when they arrived. This time, the heralds lay silent. You did not attribute titles to nobody. Doing so would have insulted everything they stood for. It wasn't faith, it wasn't religion, it was hardly even a movement. Each of them fought for what was right and just, and garbed themselves in trappings based on their interpretation of reform. Some lost themselves in it, others only seemed there for the ride. But despite this, in that moment, as the final saint passed before them, Kleiphos felt so very guilty. Their vows were to protect the innocent, end the evils of those consumed by hubris, to accept no holy title, and to never wield power in the name of gods, or to place obscene importance in idols. But despite Kleiphos feeling like he'd done those things, the saint made him feel like he had still failed his vows. He didn't know what the saint looked like, could hardly remember their voice or the one time he'd heard it. They were once in the Scarlet Chosen, right? A masked monk before they became... more. But was that true? Why was he trying so hard to remember? How could he ever hope to become even close to as humble as... them? They were humble. He knew this. They had never claimed a title or ordered others to follow them. Perhaps that's why he had chosen them. He had tired of the petty pretensions of people who thought they were above him because of their dynastic inbreeding. But humility didn't mean... well, it didn't mean you didn't have... What did they have? Glory? Power? Magnetism? He couldn't think of the word for it, not while his tongue was swelling up inside his sweating head. Something about the saint pulled, as if Kleiphos' very essence was dragging from his body. Nobody cheered for them, nobody clapped, not even a whisper. They'd always had that effect on the others, but him? He'd seen them once before, during his first campaign, somewhere in some Opakazian village just as nowhere as his home. Camarina? It had only lasted a few minutes, the saint speaking some quiet words to the assorted militant. It had swept him away then, but now? It was as if they were stronger, or perhaps they had better learnt to sit in the role of a god? A greater being? They would have derided for thinking that, but he... The others were kneeling. He could hear a few others, having been just as entranced, shuffling down behind him. Horrible showing of professionalism, terrible discipline, utterly awful, humiliating, and only just barely assuaged by several Calistoans snapping out of their own trances and saluting a minute too late. He was the last to his kneel. He focused at the dirt before him, Kleiphos doing everything he could to resist the urge to look up, even when one armored boot carefully stepped onto the dirty road before his sight. Did it step? Was it always there? He didn't know why it was a mystery. It took another daze to realize that there were now 2 boots. The saint was standing before him. The saint themselves, the Nameless one, the Forgotten, as some had called them. They were standing there before him, and his head drifted up in confusion. It was a break of discipline, but what was he to do? They hadn't drilled for this. None of the other saints had stopped for a quick chat with old Kleiphos on the way to the meeting to decide the fate of the world in the Second Empire. You doubt. The voice came from behind their silvered mask. Yet you believe. Warring thoughts, ideas, cynicism, optimism, and hope. Each one, and more, and less. Despite his best attempt, his throat wouldn't clear. He wasn't choking, but it was like the muscles in his neck were just as wrapped with shock as the rest of him. He could only vaguely feel Osithos staring at him in wonder. Had their reformer ever spoken to, well, one of them? He'd never heard of such a thing. Parthsa's yapping was in his head then, telling him to stand and answer. She'd never be so improper to have said it aloud, but apparently Parthsa had become the angry, overly proper angel on his shoulder over the years they'd campaigned together, and he let her whining drag him to his feet. You stand. Formality. You knelt in reverence. Would that not be more formal, with such imagination? More appropriate to your image of this one? How the fuck was he supposed to answer this? I am honored. Your image I have is, you are. You doubt, they echoed out. Idle curiosity, a moment of thought. Tell it. His throat worked to find the words, to doubt and question, and do it to them, of all people? You're not... He struggled again. I will follow you to the death. I vowed myself to your service, but we do not call them saints when they hear. They dislike the word. You teach the evils of iconography, of hubris, and of exaltation of the self as divinity. Thus is preached and practiced by your order and 1,000 others before and after. There weren't eyes behind the mask. Darkness, for sure, and his mind told him that the eyes veiled within them were blue, then green, then red, old, young, a woman's, a man's. Something reflected there, 100 different reflections, red and blasted sands and ravines, darkened and bone-covered land, endless desert sands with a great sandstone tower, of a black hand reaching down upon a magi, 1,000 lives and one, not anybody, not nobody, those of many. The images stopped as soon as they came. He did not know where they came from. The world verges, the saint spoke. It stutters and creaks. One day it will be no more.
but that day is tomorrow, or an eon past and long ago destroyed in the attempt to save the present. One day, the great imagination hosting us will crumble, as will the great dreamer who hosts it.
The saint didn't pause for a breath, but a stutter came through. Not like they had tripped over a word, but more like they had somehow spoken dreamer twice at once. Kleiphos tried to think on this, to remember the voice, only finding memories of 1,000 competing voices saying each word at once. The Nameless paused at it, tried the word around somewhere within the mask, then slowly turned their head to look at the crowd. He could now remember the words they spoke, but not else, the voices vanishing from his mind.
But that is in 200 years, or in 2000. The creators, the purest, the first men, the keepers of the tower, the walkers of the path, the jailers of the pillars, all bring destruction. The only way is the way without, the end to such things. To hold this one up is to fill their pedestal, to write doom into the legacy of they who you call saint.
They turned back, and Kleiphos saw no eyes there.
Put no faith in divinity, nor belief in vanity. Extol the self, cast out doubt brought upon by those who hold power and heavens unending. Doubt, divinity, exaltation, endings. Cast the saint from your mind, and do not follow in this rebellion. Follow where you shall, but no creator and no practitioner. As your others have, as they will one day. It is a path to destruction, doubt, misery, fear.
Something seemed to close, curtains being pulled over his mind. There was no goodbye, but this meeting, he could feel it ending.
Doubt, anger, confusion, disbelief, run through your mind. All of it. One day you shall feel more, then less. Anger consumes and destroys, just as divinity. Cast all out. The others destroy the self not for humility, but for fear of their fear. One day the rejectors will understand truth, of the existence of vanity. Until then, there is doubt, and attempts, no matter when the end comes. There is simply no other way.
The saint paused and turned.
There is no I, there is no you. The one before you wishes your journey proves easy upon you, as it has for no other.
They were walking away when he heard their last words.
She does not blame you. None may do that besides yourself.
Nathsa? How did they... What? He realized then that thousands stared at him, mainly in shock and confusion. He turned to the others and received a matching awe. The Voidborn stared the most, and he was thankful that he could actually see eyes behind their masks. Surprised, jealous, amazed. What did they say to you? Osithos asked. You didn't hear? Was this a joke? He asked as he knelt and stared back at the dirt, unsure of where else to look with so many looking at him. It was all whispers. I couldn't hear a thing. By the time I even realized you were actually talking back, it was over. Kleiphos paused. How long did we speak? Only a moment, a fleeting second. At first I thought they had just asked your name. He didn't know what to make of it. They said they were not divine, that to believe such was foolish, destructive. But Kleiphos's mind was sure, or at least part of it was. Their patron was greater, amazing. Kleiphos hadn't lied when he'd said he'd have died for them, that he'd follow them to the end. But did he follow a god?